This sermon was preached at Jerseyville Baptist Church on August the 11th, 2024. It is entitled Good News Kept Secret and is based on Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 to 21. The speaker is Dr. August Konkel.
Tell me the old story. Now that's a fine line for someone that is writing in the late 19th century when we have heard this gospel story for almost 2,000 years. But it was not an old story in the days of Isaiah, which is the passage that Mark read. And by the way, you are absolutely right about the connection with the nations being dust on the scale in comparison with the great work that God is doing. That's actually found in Isaiah chapter 40, the incomparable God. We cannot even begin to understand the new thing that God is doing. A new song, says Isaiah, I am giving to you. But of course, it wasn't a song that they could really understand, and Isaiah is trying to help them accept the fact that in spite of their circumstances, God is doing something wonderful and God is doing something great. Well, the same thing is happening in the days of Jesus. It is not an old story. It is a continuation of what Isaiah had begun to promise when he said, you're going to be singing a new song. However, it was a newness that they were not quite prepared to accept. I'm going to be reading from Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 to 21. The passage just before this is Jesus walking through the fields, and the disciples, because they're hungry, pluck some of the grain that is in the fields. This is a common thing for travelers in the ancient world, that they were entitled to find food along the way. And so they were doing what was normal for travelers, except they were doing it on the Sabbath. And this was perfectly objectionable to many people's ideas about the Sabbath. So following that, we read this. Having left, Jesus then entered into their synagogue. There was a man there with a limp hand. They asked him, should one heal on the Sabbath? This was so they might bring accusations against him. Then he said to them, if someone among you had a sheep fall into a ditch on the Sabbath, who would not reach it and lift it out? How much more worth is a person than a sheep? One ought to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man with the limp hand, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was healthy, just as the other. The Pharisees went away and deliberated how they might kill him. Knowing that, Jesus left there, but great crowds followed him. He healed them all, but he warned them they should not make him known. In this way, the word of Isaiah was fulfilled when he said, here is my servant, the one I have chosen, the one who loves me, and my delight is in him. I will place my spirit on him, and he will announce justice to the nations. He will not protest, he will not shout, nor will anyone in the street hear his voice. A broken reed he will not snap off, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, until he makes justice to triumph. The nations will place their hope in his name. An interesting line in this passage, a warning. Jesus tells them that they should not make him known. Now, if you have good news, why would you not want to make it known? Usually, that's the very first thing we want to do. During the days when I was a pastor, there were a good number of young people in the church, and every once in a while, when we would have a youth meeting, one of the young ladies would begin talking with her left hand. It would always be kind of in front of her this way and turned outward this way, and then you got a signal you were supposed to change the conversation because there was good news to be shared here. Now, the thing about good news is that timing can be a bit of an issue. I remember well when I was in that phase of life, and Esther and I were planning to be married. We were visiting at home with my mother, and my mother was asking me all kinds of questions. Mothers really want to know about these things, and she wanted to get some dates, and she wanted to know what she should be thinking about and planning for. So I discussed all of this with her and told her that it was coming towards Christmas, and Esther's birthday is on December the 7th. And so I thought that in anticipation of Christmas, I would give this ring to her on her birthday. So the day arrived. We went out for the evening. I got a nice bouquet of flowers, and I tucked this ring inside the flowers. And when the evening was over, I gave her these flowers. I thought girls liked flowers. What I got was a cold, blank stare. Now that was a little concerning because I didn't think there was anything wrong with the flowers, and that left only one alternative. There was something wrong with me. That's when I discovered that there had been a little eavesdropping going on while I was having my conversation with my mother, and there was a different expectation here about good news. She was looking for a little gift-wrapped box, and all she got was flowers, and I got a blank, cold stare. Fortunately, she explored the flowers a little further, and the evening ended up rather happily, and it all turned out to be pretty good news. But that's the whole thing about good news. How do you make it known, and how do you do it at the right time? And why would it be that Jesus would say, when he is healing people, don't tell anyone about this? Now, I think the explanation for that is to be found in the story just preceding, in the person who was in the synagogue and had a hand that didn't function. Whether it was paralyzed or what was wrong with it is not obviously something we can begin to tell. Now, this was a bit of a setup. The question was, should one heal on the Sabbath day? Something remarkable here. There didn't seem to be any question in their mind as to whether or not Jesus could heal on the Sabbath. And if he could heal on the Sabbath, wouldn't that say something about who he is, and wouldn't it say something about his person? Well, not at all to these people. That wasn't in question at all. They expected he could heal on the Sabbath day. The question is, would he heal on the Sabbath day, and should he heal on the Sabbath day? Now, why was this a big issue? Well, it was a big issue because it violated their rules for the Sabbath. Now, rules aren't actually a bad thing. I need rules. I make rules for myself. If I don't have a few rules for myself, there's no hope of me even doing the things that I want to do and that I intend to do. But on the other hand, we have to be a little bit sensible about rules. And sometimes rules don't really serve their intended purpose so well as we might think, or sometimes they outlive their intended purpose. During the days when I was beginning as a professor at Winnipeg Theological Seminary, we had a dress code. Now, I was a fairly new professor at the time, and I was scrambling to keep up with what I should be doing in class, and frankly, I knew nothing about the dress code or what it contained, though all the students were expected to know it, but I didn't think it was my responsibility to enforce it, and really didn't know anything about it. That didn't seem to be a problem, but one of the things in the dress code was you could not wear jeans to class. Now that may seem perfectly absurd to you, and actually in some senses it was perfectly absurd, but it had a history. Because you see, in earlier days, jeans were a statement. And they were usually a statement about some kind of restlessness, rebellion, disagreement with established society. If you had a new pair of jeans, you had to fade them and shoot them up with holes so they looked old. So there was a rule. You can't wear jeans to class. I was going down the hall, and the professor, the dean of the seminary, was away. So there was no one really around to enforce the rules, and an adjunct professor, someone who was visiting, had been much more diligent than me. He knew the rules, and he knew the dress code. And he comes running out in the hall, and he says, I've got a student here, he's supposed to write the exam, and he's wearing jeans. I can't let him write the exam when he's wearing jeans. And I said, oh. Well, I said, did you ask him about it? He said, yeah. He offered to take them off. Well, that really wasn't quite the solution that was being looked for at the time. I just kept on walking down the hall. I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Now, I don't actually know the end of that story. I don't know what happened, but I'm pretty sure the jeans stayed on. And eventually the rule got changed. Now, there's a lot of times rules are just like that. These people in the synagogue were most concerned about their rules. That's what mattered. And whether or not these rules actually served the purpose of what God intended for the Sabbath, that never seemed to quite register. Of course, Jesus needn't have violated their rules. He could have waited until the next day and just as easily healed the man on the next day. But he chose to deliberately violate their rules, make them so angry about it that they were willing to put him to death over this matter. So why would he do that? Why would he deliberately set them off in agitation and anger them over the fact that he broke one of their rules? Well, it was actually a part of Jesus' teaching. He was trying to help them to understand what God intended for the Sabbath. What does the Sabbath mean? And how are you supposed to observe it? Now here we should go back to the whole idea of redemption. We should go back to the whole idea of good news, because that's what the Sabbath was all about. The first time you read about Sabbath is in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. When all of creation was at rest, when there was no conflict, then God himself could be at rest. He was the provider for creation, but conflict was over. There was shalom, there was peace, there was Shabbat. This is the ideal. This is redemption. This is what you're looking for. And so when God gave the 10 words to his people, he was telling them, remember, that this is part of the journey to Shabbat. This is redemption. It's to make us have life the way God intended it to be. And in fact, a part of the very instruction was, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. I redeemed you. Therefore, you make confession of that redemption by observing this one day of the week in which you absent yourselves from the conflict of this world. Very interesting that in this word, this instruction that God gave to his people, there never was any specification as to how they should do that. What exactly is it that they should call work? It was never defined. And that was very deliberate. Because, of course, what it means for any individual at any particular point in time to absent themselves from their work, from their conflict, from their stress, from whatever it is that makes life challenging, that depends on time and circumstance. You may make your own rules for discipline in regards to that, but you can't determine for everybody else how it is that they're going to observe this Shabbat. You have to remember this. It's for life. It's for healing. It's all about redemption. And Jesus was trying to tell them that when I heal a man of his disability, I am actually doing what the Sabbath was meant to be. I am actually bringing about a restoration. I'm bringing about something of the way life should be. This was not a lesson they were prepared to hear. Not a lesson they were prepared to receive, even when a little logic was used. Jesus said, don't you do the same thing? If your sheep, one of your sheep, you've got a whole flock of sheep and just one falls into the ditch, you don't leave him there. You reach him out, you pick him up, you put him back in the flock. You understand instinctively what this redemption is all about. And here's a person. He needs some help. He needs some healing. You don't think that a person is of greater value than a sheep? Irrelevant to them. Didn't matter. It violated their ideas. Violated their rules. It was not for their benefit that Jesus healed this man's hand. They were not going to change. And Jesus knew they weren't going to change. But it was part of what is necessary in declaring the good news. In sharing that, as Isaiah said, there's a new song. There's something happening here. There's a redemption that is taking place. And so the great crowds followed him. Jesus left, but he was not able to escape all these people. And of course, he kept on doing what he was doing. He kept on bringing about the word of the kingdom. And the word of the kingdom was established with the signs of the kingdom, the signs of giving life. As we noted last Sunday, these signs were not really understood. What they saw was something very temporary. What they saw was something good. It was relief in the moment. But it was not the word of the kingdom. The kingdom was something much more than that, as we observed a week ago. So here, in order to help us understand what this kingdom is all about, Matthew goes back to the Scriptures. How do you begin to understand this? Well, you go back to the Word of God. What is it that is really happening here? And in this case, Jesus goes back to the word of the prophet Isaiah, the word that begins with a whole new section in Isaiah chapter 40, the section about the incomparable God, the section in which Isaiah introduces the concept of servant. Now, in the passage that we read today, it's very clear who is to be a servant. I have chosen you. I've made you as a people. I've made you to be in a covenant relationship. And in a covenant relationship, you are representing this incomparable God to the nations. But in chapter 42, verse 1, there's something unique in that God speaks in the first person. And he speaks very deliberately to the mission of someone who is going to bring about redemption. Justice. It's something that's a hope for all the nations. Instead of the nations competing, even if it's in sport, the nations are going to experience harmony, cooperation, peace. They're all waiting for this. And it doesn't happen through protest. You know what's rather interesting? We think that we're going to get justice, we're going to get the change that we want if we protest. And so we've got protests erupting all the time, all over the place. Sometimes they're not at all peaceful protests. And sometimes I have no idea, no one has any idea what actually is being protested. I will have to admit that I'm no great fan of pop singers, but there was a big concert, as you know, that was supposed to take place in Vienna, in Austria. This woman attracts many tens of thousands of people, and the whole thing got canceled over a threat of somebody protesting something. Here were people who had traveled, in some cases, from another continent to hear this concert, and it's canceled over a protest. And we don't even know what the protest was about. Well, the servant doesn't operate that way. He does not protest in the street. You don't even hear his voice. This servant shares his good news through the effect of what he does. Now, as we know from the book of Isaiah, this servant is encountered again, and we know him most specifically from Isaiah chapter 53. And there especially we hear the words, "Who knows this? Who believes this? Who even recognizes that this is someone who's bringing redemption?" No, he's led as a sheep to the slaughter. And he's the one who dies on behalf of the people. Isaiah had a vision. He had a vision of a redemption that was going to change because of a power to change people themselves. That's what it needed. Something internal. It's not good news about some external thing that's going to be brought to us, even some external thing like the healing of a limp hand. No, it's not something external. The good news is something that actually changes our way of thinking. It changes who we are. And so Isaiah says, this was God's plan. I'm the one who made the heavens. And what I made especially in relation to the earth and the heavens was people. And the translation brought that out very nicely. The exact Hebrew words are, he gave nishmat to the people. You give a ruach to the ones who live on the earth and everything it produces. Now, those are metaphorical words, but they're very clear. Nishmat, translated usually as breath, is something only persons have. Only people have a nishmat. And the ruach, usually we often translate it spirit, but it's used by the Hebrews to mean our mind, our ability to think. In the book of Job, Elihu especially called it that. I've got a mind, a ruach, and therefore you got to listen to me, even if I'm young. So who has God specially created in all of this creation? Persons. It's kind of an irony that in the world in which we live, a person cannot be defined. You can ask any biologist what they mean by the word person, and they will begin to demur. How do you distinguish person? We're just part of a biological continuum. You start with the simplest life forms, and they get a little more complex, and we get to be the most complicated ones of all. But who's to determine what is a person? In fact, the American Scientific Affiliation about 10 years ago proposed that cetaceans, these are whale-type creatures that communicate in very sophisticated ways. We don't understand it, but they do. And so the proposal was, these are persons. That's our world. Rather confused. But it's not confusing within the Scriptures. Persons have an ability to represent God, an ability to speak for God. Persons aren't defined biologically. They're defined by who they are. They're defined by how they think. And Isaiah says, I've made you a covenant people. You are a kingdom of priests, God says at the Mount Sinai. In other words, you have the capacity to represent me. You are a light to the nations. And you speak to those who are in bondage, those who are in prison, those who can't see anything in the darkness. You represent me to them. And you represent me as the one whose glory can be shared with none other. In fact, it's in this passage where God says, I am Yahweh. That is my name. He is with us. I am He is the way Jesus says it when He quotes it in reference to Himself in John chapter 8. He's actually quoting this very verse from Isaiah, an almost identical form. This is God. It's Yahweh. And He's doing a new thing. The Exodus, that redemption, that is something that is now superseded. Those in bondage, those in darkness, in this case, it's those who are in exile in Babylon that Isaiah is especially addressing, who feel hopeless, who feel lost, who think that there's no future for them. There's a new song. God is bringing a new redemption. And these servants, Israel, they are the ones who are to be the light, who are to bring the redemption, the news of the redemption, the good news. And of course, we understand that that specific servant who's going to bring justice and peace to the nations, who's going to bring about the redemption, the Sabbath that we're all looking for, we understand. That's who Jesus represented. That's what Jesus was trying to teach them. And to us, it's an old story if we've heard it. But we live in a world where it's not an old story. Now, it's wonderful to hear that there are people who will pack the facilities to hear, to get a radio, a device that will give them the gospel, the ability to hear the gospel. It's just wonderful to hear that. But that's not our world. That's not the world we live in. The world we live in is where the Bible, the Word, the good news is not known. The book is not known. And if it is known, it's despised. The good news is heard. It's known. But as it was in the days of Jesus, we're preoccupied as a society with all our own values, with all the things we think are important, and we have all our own rules and regulations, and we have no time to hear about good news. So how are we this light? How do we teach as Jesus said, as Jesus did? We do it the same way Jesus did. We bring that good deed, that help, that redemption in every way we can, in the way that we live. There will be some who will hear. There will be some that will know. In our Bible study last week, we were looking at another section of Isaiah in which it is quoted when Jesus uses the parable about sowing the seed. And much of the seed hits the path. Some of it hits rocky soil. A lot of it hits the weeds. But there is that bit that hits the fertile ground. And it yields. And that's what we need to know. What we need to know is that we are called to be that servant. The servant that Jesus was. The servant that Isaiah talked about. The servant that knows how to live out this redemption. The servant that knows how to bring about in our own little corner, in our own little way, help for someone else. Enable them to see that there's a hope of redemption. And some will know. And some will hear. And we will be the one who has been able to share this good news. It may need to be kept a secret in some ways. I marvel at the ways in which we manage to live in denial. Jesus was giving evidence of the fact that there's redemption. There's a life giver. You can heal a limp man's hand. I have a very good friend. He's a professor at Tyndale University. He's young. He's like Mark. He's like many of you here. Not very much experience yet in comparison. And he had an ailment. He was out playing ball and suddenly he's stumbling around on the field. He gets rushed to the hospital and ends up in crisis. He had such severe heart damage that the news his wife got repeatedly in the many weeks that followed was that they were going to have to do a special procedure. Very dangerous. They would never attempt this, but unless they did it, my friend would die. And each one of these he ended up surviving. But the day came when he went back to see the original cardiologist, the original person that had looked at his heart, at the time when he was first afflicted. He was told, "You'll be an invalid if you live. You'll be an invalid. You will not be able to live a normal life." Many months later, after much benefit from the good work that healthcare does, after much benefit, this doctor saw him and was absolutely bewildered. He said, "That's not the heart I saw. This heart is normal. I have no idea what's happened here. I can't tell you." My friend today teaches as he did before. He lives a perfectly normal life. He doesn't share that story with very many people. Why not? Because they will rationalize it. They will dismiss it. They're not willing to hear that this might be part of what God is doing in this new song, in this new redemption. But he shared it with me, one of the few, partly because I badgered him and probed him until he found it easier to tell it than to not tell it. That's a talent that I have sometimes. I can provoke people in all sorts of ways. It's a wonderful story. But it's exactly like it was in the synagogue. Seeing the sign of redemption brings no interest in knowing what this redemption might be about. However, there will be a few. In the case of Jesus, it was 12, more or less. And from those 12 has come the church that can now sing about the old story. Let's sing it. It's not a new song to us. In some ways, it's an old story. But for many that need to hear it, it's a very new song. And there are those who are waiting to hear this good news of the kingdom. That's our task. Be faithful. Live the citizen of the kingdom. Be a light to those around. That's all that God asks. That's a huge task that God asks. May we have the grace to do that. Lord, give us this new song and teach us to sing about the old story in ways that those who are the good soil may respond and come to experience the redemption of the kingdom. In your name we pray. Amen.